Have you ever wondered what happens when the life you carefully planned completely falls apart in a single moment, leaving you stranded in an unfamiliar world with nowhere left to turn? This is a story about resilience, unexpected crossroads, and the quiet strength it takes to rebuild your entire existence from the ashes of rejection when you least expect it. It explores how being cast aside by someone who only valued superficial surface beauty can unexpectedly open the door to a deeper, far more genuine kind of belonging. If you find yourself drawn to this type of deep, moving narrative, please do not forget to subscribe to our channel, Wildwood Hearts. We take great pride in posting brand new videos every single day to keep you company. So make sure to hit that notification bell and give this video a like if you enjoy this story. We would also absolutely love it if you left a comment down below, telling us exactly where you are watching from in the world, and what time of day or night you are listening to us right now. Part 1. The vast Wyoming territory in the scorching late August of 1884 was a place where distances were measured in long days of travel, and letters were often the only fragile threads connecting people to their past lives back east. For Abigail Vance, that thread snapped completely when the postmaster handed back the envelope she had sent weeks ago, now heavily smudged with dust and bearing the harsh words, "Returned no longer wanted," written in a rough, unfamiliar hand across the front. She sat frozen on the splintered wooden bench just outside the small sun-baked station house in Laramie City, staring down at the ink as her fingers clenched tightly around her cotton skirt. The heavy steam train that had brought her across the country had rattled off down the tracks over an hour ago, leaving behind a thick cloud of dark smoke that gradually dissolved into the endless, empty blue sky. The name of her former fiancé, Jedediah Thorne, which had once represented a grand promise of security, a shared future, and a brand new life in the West, no longer carried any meaning or warmth at all. Just a short while earlier, Abigail had walked down the dusty street to the local boarding house, where Jedediah had arranged for her to stay, only to be met by a tight-lipped woman who looked her up and down with cold disapproval. The woman had not even invited her inside the hallway, choosing instead to stand firmly in the doorway while she muttered that Jedediah had changed his mind because he considered her far too plain and not at all the beautiful woman he had expected from her letters. With those words, the door had been shut firmly in her face, leaving Abigail standing on the boardwalk with her old leather suitcase sitting heavily at her feet. She was still wearing the blue patterned dress that she had spent weeks sewing so carefully by hand back home in Indiana, ensuring every stitch was perfect. Her dark hair was neatly pinned up beneath her bonnet, and her sturdy leather shoes were meticulously polished, as she had done everything exactly the way she was supposed to do. Yet, despite all her preparation, she had been discarded like an unwanted piece of freight, with no home left to return to, and absolutely no one waiting for her in this vast, empty territory. As the late afternoon sun began to sink lower on the horizon, it cast long, deep golden shadows across the wide dirt road of Laramie City, where heavy freight wagons creaked past, their iron-rimmed wheels churning up thick clouds of dust. A few local ranch hands leaned against the wooden railing outside the neighborhood saloon, laughing loudly at some private joke, completely oblivious to the stranded woman sitting alone across the street. Abigail remained perfectly still on her bench, fighting down the rising sob in her throat, because she refused to let strangers see her break down in tears in the middle of a strange town. From across the wide thoroughfare, a lone man sitting quietly on a dark horse had been watching her patiently for several minutes, noting her solitary posture and the heavy suitcase at her feet. He was a tall, exceptionally broad-shouldered individual with short, sun-bleached brown hair, and a remarkably calm, deliberate manner that seemed to distance him from the noisy activity of the town around him. His canvas coat was coated in a thick layer of gray trail dust. His dark hat was pulled low over his brow, and his weathered face bore the unmistakable look of a man who had already experienced more than his fair share of hardship. The stranger dismounted from his horse with slow, unhurried movements, tossing the leather reins over his arm as he walked directly across the dusty street toward the station bench. He stopped a few feet away from her, looking down with a steady expression, and asked in a surprisingly quiet and gentle voice if she was currently waiting for someone to pick her up. Abigail looked up, startled by the unexpected kindness in his tone, and tried to speak, but her voice cracked with emotion as she admitted that she was supposed to be waiting for someone, but was no longer. The man glanced down briefly at the rejected letter held tightly in her lap, then looked at the single leather suitcase resting on the gravel beside her boots, before asking where her home was located. Abigail swallowed hard, staring out at the unfamiliar buildings, and replied honestly that she no longer had a home anywhere in the world to go back to. The tall rancher nodded slowly, looking down the long dirt street as if he were carefully weighing a significant decision in his mind, before turning back to introduce himself as Silas Vance. Silas explained in his calm, straightforward manner that he owned a small, modest homestead located several miles west of the town, where he raised a small herd of cattle and was raising 2 young children on his own. Abigail raised her eyebrows in quiet surprise, but remained silent as Silas continued, explaining that his wife had passed away from a severe winter illness nearly 3 years ago, and that he was not seeking anything improper from her. He stated plainly that she simply looked like a decent person who could desperately use a safe roof over her head and a warm supper for the night, rather than being left stranded on a station bench after dark. Abigail blinked rapidly, her throat tightening with a mixture of caution and exhaustion as she pointed out that she did not know him at all and had no reason to trust a stranger. Silas did not argue or take offense, stating simply that he was not asking for her immediate trust, but was merely offering her a safe place to rest her head and a hot meal, with the absolute freedom to leave the next morning if she wished. She hesitated for a long moment, looking down at her hands, but when she looked up into his face, she saw an expression of genuine, unforced kindness that contained no pity or hidden motives. It was simply the look of a practical man who had spotted someone left out in the cold and had decided, out of basic human decency, to do something about it. "All right," she said softly, rising from the hard bench and accepting his assistance as he held the horse steady so she could climb up onto the leather saddle. Silas picked up her heavy suitcase, securing it behind the saddle, and then took the horse's reins in his hand, walking patiently on foot alongside the animal while Abigail rode. They left the noisy, dusty edges of Laramie City behind, just as the sun dipped completely below the mountains, and the immense, silent prairie opened up wide and empty all around them in the gathering twilight. By the time they finally approached his homestead, deep purple dusk had settled over the land, revealing a modest, weathered log house that was worn at the corners but kept perfectly neat. A large timber barn stood off to the side of the property, where a dozen milk cows were milling around quietly near the wooden fence rails in the cool evening air. 2 young children, a boy and a girl, came running out of the house into the dirt yard, their bare feet kicking up small puffs of dust as they hurried to meet the horse. The boy appeared to be about 9 years old while his younger sister looked no more than 6, and both stopped abruptly in their tracks the moment they noticed a strange woman riding their father's horse. The boy looked up at his father with a puzzled expression and asked who she was, prompting Silas to tell them that this was Miss Abigail and that she would be staying the night with them. He firmly told the children to mind their manners, and though they continued to stare at her with wide, curious eyes, they did not offer any argument as Abigail gave them a small, tentative smile. The boy stepped forward slightly and politely introduced himself as Arthur, pointing down at his smaller sister and explaining that her name was Maeve, who was currently hiding behind her brother's elbow. Abigail followed Silas inside the house, where the interior smelled pleasantly of split wood smoke, dried herbs, and freshly brewed coffee. The main room was clean and orderly, though it was furnished in a very plain, utilitarian manner with a sturdy oak table and simple wooden chairs near the hearth. A small cooking fire burned low in the stone fireplace, and a large iron stew pot was bubbling gently on the top of the cast-iron stove, filling the room with a rich aroma. Silas pulled out a chair for her, and after they had all settled down around the wooden table, he handed her a generous bowl of the hot food. He remarked that he hoped she liked beef stew, and Abigail nodded her head in gratitude, still finding it difficult to speak past the heavy ache of rejection that remained lodged in her chest. She had been completely discarded by her fiancé that very morning, and now she found herself eating supper with an absolute stranger and 2 quiet, solemn children on the remote edge of the territory. After a long period of silence, Abigail looked across the table and softly mentioned that he had spoken earlier of having a wife, which caused Silas to give a solemn nod of affirmation. He explained that her name had been Hannah, and that a sudden severe fever had taken her life 3 years ago, leaving him to do his absolute best to raise Arthur and Maeve all by himself. Abigail looked down at her bowl, her fingers tracing the edge of the wood, and shared that she was also supposed to marry someone today, but he had stopped writing completely after she sent him her photograph. She explained that his sister had ultimately informed her that she was far too plain to be a suitable wife, and that he had essentially sent her back like an unwanted package. Silas did not flinch or look away from her gaze upon hearing this, stating firmly that he had known a beautiful woman once, as Hannah had been truly lovely to look at. However, he insisted that it was never her physical appearance that he missed, but rather how remarkably strong she was, how deeply she listened, and how fiercely she loved their children. Abigail looked up at him, her eyes wide, as Silas stated plainly that he did not care about superficial beauty or fancy appearances, because he only valued what was real and steady in a person. Abigail sat completely still as those words settled over her like a warm, comforting blanket, realizing that no one had ever spoken to her in such a meaningful way in her entire life. It was the first time someone had made her feel like who she was on the inside mattered infinitely more than how she looked to a superficial observer. After the two children had been washed and put to bed in their small room, Abigail stood awkwardly near the front door, offering to go sleep out in the barn if it would be more comfortable for the family. Silas immediately refused, insisting that she would take the main bed. In the private room, while he slept on a bedroll by the hearth, she opened her mouth to argue, but she could see the absolute certainty in his eyes and knew his mind was entirely made up, so she simply thanked him and walked into the small bedroom. The bed was firm but comfortable, covered in a beautiful quilt that had clearly been stitched by hand with great care and patience. She lay down beneath the blankets and stared up at the wooden beams of the ceiling, listening to the quiet popping of the dying fire in the next room while reflecting on how drastically her day had changed. That morning, she had been thrown away and humiliated, but tonight she found herself warm, well-fed, and completely safe under the roof of a decent man. She was still incredibly afraid to let herself hope for anything, but something about the steady way Silas had looked at her made her feel like she was not a broken person. She finally fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, with the rejected letter still tucked way inside her suitcase, but her heavy heart felt just a little bit lighter than it had been when she arrived. Thank you so much for listening to the story so far. What do you think is going to happen next with Abigail and Silas? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We truly appreciate you taking the time to listen, and please remember to subscribe to our channel, Wildwood Hearts, for more daily stories just like this one. Abigail woke the next morning to the distinct, sharp sound of thick pieces of meat sizzling loudly in a heavy cast-iron pan, the rich, savory smell drifting under the wooden door of her small room and pulling her completely out of a deep, dreamless sleep. She lay there for a long moment, staring up at the rough-hewn wooden beams of the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of the household already moving around in the main living area, and she realized with a mild sense of shock that she had not woken up feeling the crushing, suffocating weight of yesterday's sudden rejection. The thick handmade quilt pulled up to her chin was incredibly warm against the brisk morning chill that had seeped through the log walls during the night, and she took a slow, deep breath to steady her nerves before pushing the heavy covers aside and placing her feet on the cold wooden floorboards. She dressed quickly and carefully in her blue patterned dress, ensuring every button was properly fastened and her hair was neatly pinned back into a practical bun, determined to present herself as useful and composed before stepping out into the main room to face the family. When she finally opened her bedroom door, she found Silas already fully dressed in his clean, sturdy work clothes, standing near the hot stove, while Arthur and Maeve sat completely silent and well-behaved at the long wooden table, their small hands neatly folded in their laps as they waited for their meal. Silas immediately turned away from the stove and handed her a warm tin plate, loaded with generous portions of breakfast the moment she walked into the room, looking at her with a steady, appraising gaze as he politely asked if she had managed to sleep all right during the night. Abigail nodded her head gratefully, thanking him quietly for his hospitality as she took her seat at the table, and after they had all finished the simple but filling meal in comfortable silence, she stood up and calmly announced that she would go gather her belongings from the bedroom to be on her way. Silas looked directly at her, his expression incredibly serious and thoughtful, and asked if she was genuinely planning on heading all the way back east to Indiana after everything that had transpired. She answered him with complete honesty, keeping her voice steady despite the lingering ache in her chest, stating clearly that she had absolutely nowhere else to go and no one waiting for her anywhere in the world. He studied her face carefully for a long, quiet moment before stating, plainly, that she could stay right there on the homestead, quickly clarifying that he did not mean as a temporary guest, but because there was a great deal of actual demanding work to be done around the property every single day. He explained in his straightforward manner that his children could desperately use someone to help them practice their reading and daily lessons, and he could certainly use an extra pair of hands to manage the extensive daily upkeep of the house, offering her the chance to make this isolated place her actual home if she truly wanted to. Her throat tightened with unexpected emotion as she asked him why he would offer such a generous thing to a complete stranger he had only just met, and he simply replied that it was because she seemed remarkably kind, steady, and entirely real, noting that he had already experienced superficial things in his life and had decided he only wanted what was genuine from now on. Abigail's hands trembled slightly at her sides as she looked over at the two young children who were watching the exchange with wide, curious eyes, before looking back at the tall rancher and softly agreeing that she could stay, at least for the time being, though the undeniable warmth in his steady eyes strongly suggested he sincerely hoped her stay would last much longer. The morning sun had already fully cleared the rocky eastern ridge when Abigail stepped outside the house with a battered tin pail swinging lightly in her hand, fully prepared to start making herself useful around the busy property. The fresh air held the lingering, pleasant warmth of late summer, and the distinct, earthy scent of dry prairie grass drifted faintly on the gentle breeze as she shaded her eyes with her free hand, scanning the gentle slope behind the large wooden barn where Silas had disappeared just moments before. With a heavy leather bridle slung casually over his broad shoulder, she eventually found young Maeve crouched quietly near the wooden chicken coop, her small, delicate palms completely full of yellow grain as she patiently waited for the birds to approach her. The little girl was humming a very low, soothing melody to herself, carefully watching the dozen hens peck rapidly around the worn toes of her leather boots without making any sudden movements that might frighten them away. Abigail approached slowly so as not to startle the child or the birds, stopping a few feet away and politely asking if she might be allowed to help with the morning feeding chores. Maeve nodded her head slowly but did not speak a single word, simply reaching out and handing over a small handful of the hard grain kernels before pointing silently to the far corner of the dusty yard where the large wooden feed bin was securely positioned against the fence. Abigail followed the child's silent gesture, walked over to the heavy bin, filled a small canvas sack with fresh grain, and returned to the coop to scatter it gently and evenly across the packed dirt ground so all the birds could eat. The chickens immediately swarmed toward the newly thrown food, their feathers rustling loudly in the quiet morning air as they competed for the best pieces of grain near Abigail's feet. She looked down at the busy birds and asked Maeve in a soft, conversational tone if she truly enjoyed taking care of the small flock every day. Maeve nodded her head once again, her young face remaining entirely solemn and serious as she finally broke her silence to explain, quietly, that the animals always knew when a person was being genuinely gentle with them. Abigail blinked in genuine surprise, taken aback by the sudden clarity and depth of the little girl's voice after experiencing so much heavy silence from her the entire day before. She smiled warmly at the child and agreed softly, stating that she believed that specific observation was incredibly true of most living things in the world, not just the farm animals. Maeve tilted her head slightly to the side, carefully considering the older woman's words for a moment before stating that her father always said that sometimes the most gentle things were actually the strongest things of all. Abigail's lips curved into a small, thoughtful smile, feeling caught somewhere between the lingering ache of her recent rejection and a brand new, softer feeling blooming in her chest as she told the little girl that her father was absolutely right about that. Later that same morning, Abigail found herself standing near the long, perfectly straight rows of the vegetable garden, while Arthur worked diligently at removing a stubborn cluster of deep-rooted weeds with a heavy iron garden implement that was clearly a bit too long and cumbersome for his short arms to manage properly. She watched him struggle for several minutes, noting how his small hands gripped the thick wooden handle tightly as he repeatedly struck the hard dirt, expending far too much energy for very little result. Finally, she stepped closer, to the edge of the tilled soil and calmly observed aloud that he was striking the thick root of the weed directly from the side, which was making the task much more difficult than it needed to be. The young boy huffed in clear frustration, wiping a line of sweat from his dusty forehead with the back of his sleeve, and defensively muttered that this was exactly how everyone else always did it when they worked in the garden. Abigail did not argue or correct him harshly. Instead, she crouched down, right beside him in the loose dirt, gently placing her hand over his on the wooden handle and nudging the heavy iron end slightly lower toward the base of the plant. She instructed him in a calm, encouraging voice to try angling the tool downward just a fraction more, explaining that doing so would allow him to get underneath the base of the weed much cleaner and pull the entire root system out at once. Arthur grumbled slightly, but followed her precise instructions, trying the new angle on his next attempt, and to his visible surprise, the thick, stubborn stalk came up out of the soil much easier this time, leaving a clean hole behind. He stopped working for a moment and leaned against the long wooden handle, glancing over at her with a look of genuine uncertainty and curiosity in his eyes before bluntly asking if she was actually a professional farmer back where she came from. Abigail smiled at the direct question and explained patiently that she had grown up spending every single day helping her father work on a very large parcel of agricultural land situated near a wide river back in Illinois. She added quietly that her father had unfortunately passed away when she was only 16 years old, forcing her to learn how to manage many of the heavy chores entirely on her own. Arthur immediately looked back down at the loose dirt near his boots, suddenly looking a bit awkward and uncomfortable with the serious turn the conversation had taken, and muttered defensively that he was almost 10 years old and could handle his own chores just fine. Abigail wisely chose not to speak into the heavy silence that followed his statement, simply remaining crouched beside him and allowing him the space to process the interaction without any unnecessary pressure. The boy worked a few more stubborn weeds loose from the dry soil using the new technique she had just taught him, and then suddenly stopped again, remarking quietly that his little sister Maeve hardly ever talked to strangers who visited the homestead. Abigail stood up slowly, brushing the loose, dry dirt from the palms of her hands onto her cotton skirt, and replied kindly that Maeve was certainly not the only person on this property who paid close attention to who was being gentle with them. By the time the midday sun reached its highest point in the clear blue sky, casting short, dark shadows across the dusty yard, Silas returned to the homestead from the far pasture with his work shirt heavily dampened from sweat and a long leather lead rope dragging loosely in the dirt behind him. A large, muscular brown workhorse followed closely at his side, its head bobbing unevenly as it limped noticeably on its front left leg with every single step it took toward the barn. Silas stopped near the wooden water trough and explained briefly that the animal had suffered a bad stone bruise, nodding his head down toward the horse's injured foreleg, and adding that the heavy creature had unfortunately stepped exactly wrong while navigating the uneven, rocky ground near the dry creek bed earlier that morning. Without needing to be asked, Abigail immediately turned and hurried back into the main house, quickly fetching a clean cotton rag and a small metal tin of healing salve that she had noticed tucked carefully away on a shelf near the stone hearth the night before. She returned to the yard just as quickly and knelt down directly beside the massive, shifting animal's injured leg, showing absolutely no fear as she carefully applied the thick medicinal ointment to the bruised hoof with slow, deliberate pressure. Silas stood very close nearby, keeping a firm grip on the leather halter to ensure the nervous horse remained steady, but his eyes were entirely focused on watching the confident, highly capable way Abigail's hands moved over the injury. He watched her work in absolute silence for a few moments before calmly stating aloud that it was very obvious she had done this specific type of difficult hands-on work many times before in her life. Abigail kept her eyes focused downward on the horse's hoof, carefully rubbing the salve into the tender area, and explained that their closest neighbor back in Illinois had kept a large team of heavy draft horses for plowing. She added with a small, fond smile that the old farmer used to let her come over and help care for the massive animals whenever she brought his wife a fresh batch of homemade fruit preserves from her family's kitchen. Silas slowly crouched down right beside her in the dirt, his strong forearm briefly brushing against hers as he shifted his position to better steady the large animal's considerable weight, while she finished wrapping the clean rag around the hoof. He looked at her profile intently and remarked in a low, serious tone that there were certainly not very many women in the world who would willingly walk right up and confidently touch a large, lame workhorse without showing any hesitation. Abigail finally finished tying the makeshift bandage securely in place, wiped her slightly greasy hands on her work apron, and replied simply and honestly that she was absolutely not like most other women he might have met. Silas continued to look at her from just a few inches away, an entirely unreadable, deeply thoughtful expression passing briefly through his eyes as he stated quietly that he already knew that fact to be completely true. The immense weight and absolute certainty of his brief, quiet words seemed to instantly wrap warmly around her entire body, making her feel truly seen and appreciated for her practical skills, rather than judged for her plain appearance. As the late afternoon slowly stretched into the early cooler hours of the evening, Abigail stood patiently near the hot iron stove in the kitchen, continuously stirring a heavy metal pan full of thick cornmeal, while the two children busily stacked fresh kindling wood in a neat pile outside the back door. The main room of the house was still quite warm from the intense heat of the daylight hours, but she had deliberately chosen to light the stove fire again anyway, knowing that a hot meal would be necessary after such a long day of physical labor. She found that the simple, repetitive rhythm of completing all these small, ordinary household chores, folding the clean cotton towels, wiping down the wooden table, and carefully tucking away the bags of dry beans into the pantry, deeply settled her anxious nerves. The constant physical work gave her hands something incredibly useful to do, keeping her completely occupied while her racing thoughts finally had a chance to catch up with the massive, life-altering changes that had occurred over the past 2 days. Silas came walking into the house from the barn just moments before the dusk fully settled outside, his heavy leather work boots thickly coated in light gray dust, and his broad shoulders looking incredibly stiff and sore from the day's endless labor. He walked over to the wash basin in the corner of the room and began scrubbing the dirt from his hands, mentioning casually over his shoulder that he had finally managed to fix the broken wooden latch on the far pasture gate that had been causing problems all week. He explained as he dried his hands on a towel that the cows had kept slipping through the loose opening and wandering off, making the repair absolutely essential to complete before the sun went down completely. Abigail listened quietly as she continued to stir the hot cornmeal, finally turning her head to look at his exhausted posture, and stated plainly, without a single hint of accusation in her voice, that he consistently worked himself straight from the moment the sun came up until long after it went dark. He leaned against the wooden counter for a moment, letting out a long, heavy sigh, and simply stated that there was absolutely no one else out here on the frontier to do the endless mountain of chores required to keep the homestead running. She carefully scooped the hot, steaming food into 4 separate metal bowls, carried them over to the table, and calmly told him that he should not have to carry the heavy burden of the entire property completely by himself. Silas walked over and sat down at the table very slowly, wincing slightly as his sore muscles protested, and glanced over at Arthur and Maeve as they quietly came inside and immediately took their assigned places for supper. He looked back at Abigail and admitted in a quiet, slightly vulnerable voice that he honestly did not even know how to properly ask anyone for help anymore, after doing everything entirely alone for the past 3 years. She sat down directly across from him, looking him right in the eyes, and gently reminded him that he had not actually asked her for any help yesterday when she was sitting alone at the station. She pointed out that he had freely offered his assistance to a complete stranger when she needed it most, and Silas immediately met her gaze, adding softly that he had offered, and she had chosen not to run away from the hard work. She replied in a low, sincere voice that she had already done her fair share of running in her life, but she was entirely tired of constantly being in places where she was clearly not wanted by anyone. Silas did not answer her right away, letting the quiet sounds of the children eating fill the room for several moments before he finally stated, with absolute, unforced simplicity, that she was very much wanted right here in this house. After the heavy supper dishes had been thoroughly washed, dried, and carefully put away in the wooden cupboards by the children, Abigail stepped out onto the front porch to get some fresh air. The massive western sky stretched incredibly wide above her head, beautifully painted in deep, vibrant shades of violet, dark blue, and fading rust as the last remnants of the sun disappeared completely below the horizon line. She wrapped her thick woolen shawl much tighter around her shoulders to ward off the sudden evening chill that swept across the plains, standing perfectly still as she listened to the soft, distant sounds of the cattle settling down for the night in the far pastures. Silas eventually joined her outside after a little while, walking slowly across the wooden floorboards and lowering his tall frame onto the top step of the porch with a quiet, exhausted grunt that betrayed how hard he had worked that day. They sat together in a deeply comfortable, companionable silence for several long minutes, simply watching the stars begin to slowly appear one by one in the darkening sky, before Abigail finally turned her head and asked him softly what he missed the most in his life. He remained silent for a very long time, his strong hands resting on his knees as he absent-mindedly traced a deep crack in the rough wood of the step with his thumb, while he carefully considered her highly personal question. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and incredibly smooth in the quiet night air, explaining that he deeply missed the specific way his late wife Hannah used to sing soft lullabies to Maeve whenever the little girl woke up suffering from terrible night terrors. He went on to describe how much he missed the incredibly comforting smell of her freshly baked bread sitting on the kitchen windowsill to cool in the afternoons, and most of all, the simple, joyous sound of regular laughter constantly echoing throughout the rooms of the house. Abigail nodded her head slowly, completely understanding the profound, lingering weight of his loss, and shared her own deep sorrow by confessing that the single thing she missed the most in the entire world was simply hearing her own name spoken aloud by someone who actually made it sound like she truly mattered to them. Silas turned his head just enough to look at her directly, the faint light from the stars illuminating the strong, steady lines of his weathered face as he held her gaze with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. He said her name, Abigail, aloud in the quiet night, his voice carrying a deep, resonant warmth that she had never heard directed at her before, causing her to swallow hard against the sudden, overwhelming lump of emotion forming rapidly in her throat. He told her in absolute, unwavering terms that her name mattered very much on this homestead, causing her to quickly look away out toward the dark horizon, her breath catching painfully in her chest at the incredible sincerity of his simple statement. She pointed out nervously, her hands gripping the edges of her shawl tightly, that he barely even knew anything about her or her past, making it impossible for him to be so certain about her worth after only 2 days. He immediately countered her doubt by listing the things he did know for an absolute fact, that she was incredibly steady, remarkably kind, and entirely unafraid of undertaking hard physical work or facing the difficult, unvarnished truths of frontier life. He paused for a brief moment, letting the heavy truth of his words sink in, before adding quietly that possessing those specific, genuine qualities was far more than most folks ever managed to let anyone see in an entire lifetime. She said absolutely nothing in response to his profound observation, unable to find the right words to express the sudden rush of gratitude and belonging washing over her, but she allowed her hand to rest on the wooden step right near his, positioned close enough that the edges of their fingers were nearly touching in the dark. The cool evening wind rose slightly just then, sweeping across the open yard and carrying the faint, dry rustle of the leaves from the tall cottonwood trees growing heavily along the distant creek bank. From somewhere deep inside the warm house behind them, the soft, comforting sounds of Arthur and Maeve's voices rose and fell in a gentle lull of quiet, sleepy laughter as they prepared for bed. Abigail deliberately did not pull her hand away from his on the step, and he made absolutely no move to pull his away either, both of them remaining perfectly still in the peaceful, shared moment. Neither one of them felt the need to say anything else to each other for the rest of that night, because the quiet silence stretching comfortably between them was not empty or awkward. It was completely full of a patient, hopeful waiting for whatever was going to come next. The very first heavy frost of the approaching winter season arrived unseasonably early that particular year, leaving a fine, sparkling layer of delicate silver tracing the flat tops of all the wooden fence posts and coating the stiff, dead remains of the summer grass across the entire valley. Abigail rose from her warm bed long before the first light of dawn broke over the eastern hills, quickly pushing her arms into the thick, heavy wool shawl she had carefully mended by the fire the night before to ward off the freezing temperature inside the dark house. The iron kettle was already hissing faintly on the cast-iron stove when she walked into the kitchen, indicating that someone had been up even earlier than she was, so she quickly checked the firebox, stoked the glowing red coals with a metal iron, and poured the hot water to brew some morning tea. She looked out through the frosted glass of the kitchen window and saw Silas already outside working in the freezing yard, his heavy boots crunching loudly in the thick frost as he carried large buckets of grain out to the barn to feed the waiting animals. She watched him walk for a moment, noting how his head was lowered against the biting cold, and his long, measured stride remained perfectly steady, despite the heavy, awkward weight he was carrying in both hands. He had not spoken very much during the evening before, and she had respectfully chosen not to press him for conversation, knowing that the deep, comfortable ease that had grown between them now fully allowed for long periods of total silence without any fear of misunderstanding or offense. She quickly wrapped 2 thick slices of leftover cornbread in a clean cotton cloth and stepped outside into the freezing morning air, walking over to where he was working and silently holding the food out to him. He accepted the warm bread without making any comment, giving her a single, appreciative nod of his head as the early morning chill turned his quiet exhales into highly visible, thick puffs of white mist swirling in the air between them. He took a bite of the cornbread and mentioned casually that the old wooden fence running along the far west line of the property had given way again during the night, stating that he would need to ride out there immediately after breakfast to repair it. She glanced out toward the distant, frozen ridgeline where the fence was located, quickly calculating the amount of daily chores that still needed to be done at the house before quietly asking if he wanted her to come along and help him with the heavy labor. He paused his chewing for a moment, looking thoughtfully at her standing there shivering in her shawl, and then replied in a low voice that he honestly would not mind having her company on the long ride. Suddenly, Maeve's soft, timid voice spoke up from directly behind them, politely asking if she could please stay behind at the house today and help Abigail go through the difficult process of making a fresh batch of soap. Abigail turned around immediately to find the little girl standing on the porch, clutching her own small woolen shawl tightly against her chest with both hands, her heavy leather boots barely tied securely onto her feet in her rush to get outside in the cold. Abigail smiled warmly at the eager child and explained gently that the complex process would require them to carefully draw highly caustic lye water from the large wooden ash barrel, warning her that the strong chemical mixture would sting very badly if even a single drop accidentally touched her bare skin. Maeve nodded her head with extreme, unwavering solemnity, promising in a very serious voice that she would be extremely careful and would wear the thick leather gloves that had previously belonged to her mother. Silas looked down at his young daughter for a long moment, a complicated mix of emotions washing over his weathered face, before he finally shifted his gaze back to Abigail, quietly stating that the little girl had not asked to do that specific particular chore since the day her mother had passed away. Abigail did not look away from his intense gaze, holding his eyes steadily as she stated with absolute confidence and certainty that the child was finally ready to handle the responsibility and the memories associated with it right now. He let out a long, quiet exhale that sounded almost exactly like a profound sigh of relief, the heavy tension leaving his broad shoulders as he simply told Abigail to go ahead and let her help with the complicated process. By the middle of the morning, the freezing air had warmed slightly, and Abigail and Maeve were bent diligently over the large blackened iron wash kettle situated securely behind the house, taking turns carefully stirring the thick mixture of melted animal fat and sharp lye water with a long, worn, wooden paddle. The little girl's brow was deeply furrowed in absolute concentration as she dragged the heavy paddle through the thick liquid, determined not to let a single drop splash over the tall iron rim of the heavy pot. Abigail watched her work for a moment, admiring her dedication to the difficult task, and casually asked if her mother had been the one who originally taught her how to do this demanding homestead chore. Maeve did not stop her rhythmic stirring as she replied that her mother used to let her hold the paddle sometimes when the soap was almost finished, but she had always warned her that the strong lye was far too dangerous for a little girl to handle on her own. Abigail stepped closer and carefully checked the consistency of the thickening mixture inside the kettle, then slowly added a few more small spoonfuls of rendered lard to balance it out, remarking gently that while the process was indeed demanding, Maeve was proving to be incredibly careful and entirely capable. Maeve glanced up from the hot kettle, her small lips pressed tightly together in thought, and asked in a very quiet, hesitant voice if Abigail truly believed her mother would be glad to see that she was finally helping with the difficult work. Abigail smiled, a deep feeling of warmth spreading through her chest, and told the child with absolute certainty that her mother would be incredibly proud of her. And while the girl did not say another word, her stirring instantly grew significantly more confident and steady. Early that afternoon, after the demanding soap-making process was finally completed and the thick liquid was poured safely into the wooden setting molds, Abigail found herself riding a sturdy, sure-footed horse alongside Silas as they headed slowly toward the damaged section of the western fence line. The steady, rhythmic swaying of the horse beneath her felt incredibly secure, and the biting morning wind had finally quieted down to nothing more than a low, gentle rustle blowing softly through the dry, gray branches of the tall cottonwood trees lining the frozen creek. She easily kept pace with Silas's larger mount as they navigated the uneven, rocky terrain, and although her thighs were already growing quite sore from the rough leather saddle, she felt entirely capable and unbothered by the physical discomfort of the long ride. Silas eventually pointed a thick, leather-gloved finger toward a wide gap in the distance where several heavy wooden rails had clearly slipped completely loose from their supporting posts and fallen into the tall, frost-covered grass. He speculated aloud that the damage had most likely been caused by a wandering herd of heavy elk pushing through the boundary in the night, or perhaps just the relentless driving wind finally taking its toll after a brief midwinter thaw had weakened the wood. They both dismounted from their horses quickly, tying the leather reins securely to a nearby sturdy branch, and while Silas immediately began hammering large iron nails into the loose posts to secure them, Abigail went straight to work gathering the heavy stray wooden rails from the freezing dirt. She repeatedly carried the heavy pieces of timber over to the fence line, carefully stacking them in an organized pile exactly where he could easily reach them without ever having to pause his rhythmic swinging of the heavy hammer. As he worked, Silas did not look up from the nails, but he asked her in a conversational tone if she ever actually thought about giving up on the difficult frontier life and returning to the easier comforts of the cities back east. She shook her head firmly, stating clearly that there was absolutely no one left back there for her to return to, and adding with a surprising amount of venom in her voice that she certainly did not miss the terrible way the people there always looked at her, treating her as if she took up far too much space simply by existing and breathing the air. He made a low, rumbling sound of deep disagreement in the back of his throat, driving a thick iron nail perfectly straight into the dense wood with one massive blow before stating firmly that she absolutely did not take up too much space out here on the homestead. He looked at her then, his expression completely serious, and added that her presence actually made everything on the property feel significantly steadier and more balanced than it had been in years. The wind shifted direction slightly, carrying the rich, distinct scent of freshly turned earth from a nearby dry draw, and Abigail leaned back against a sturdy fence post crossing her arms as she watched his powerful muscles work. She asked him softly if he still found himself thinking of his late wife very often during the long, quiet days on the property, to which he paused his hammering for a moment, considered the question carefully and nodded his head in confirmation. He explained honestly that he did think of her, but not always in the overwhelmingly sad ways he used to expect. Rather, he would sometimes just catch the faint smell of her specific brand of soap, lingering in the kitchen, or he would accidentally say a phrase she used to say and startle himself with the memory. She did not interrupt the quiet silence that naturally followed his confession, simply allowing him the time to finish his thought, until he finally turned to look her right in the eyes and stated clearly that he did not feel guilty about those memories anymore, especially not when he looked directly at her now. Abigail's breath caught sharply in her chest at the incredible weight of his words, and the incredibly quiet, certain way he had delivered them settled deeply and permanently somewhere right under her ribs, anchoring her to this place. She looked right back at him, a genuine smile finally breaking across her face, and replied softly that she did not feel like a discarded, unwanted person anymore either, prompting him to straighten his back, brush the loose sawdust from the palms of his hands, and reply with deep satisfaction, "Good." They soon finished repairing the rest of the broken fence and mounted their horses once again, riding back toward the warm homestead in comfortable silence together, just as the vast winter sky above them slowly turned to a deep, impenetrable shade of dark slate gray. When they finally returned to the warmth of the homestead later that evening, the children were already safely inside the main living area, occupying themselves quietly as the dark winter night pressed heavily against the frosted window panes. Maeve was curled comfortably on the braided rug near the hearth, carefully turning the worn pages of a heavy leather-bound book, while Arthur sat at the far end of the wooden table, diligently carving a small wooden figurine from a block of soft pine with a small, blunt whittling tool. The entire house smelled deeply of rich beef stew simmering on the cast-iron stove, and the slightly sweet, heavy scent of the melting tallow candles that provided a warm, flickering light against the solid log walls. Abigail immediately walked over to the hot stove to stir the thick, bubbling pot, letting the rich steam warm her chilled face, while Silas stood near the wash basin in the corner, vigorously scrubbing the day's grime and cold from his hands and face with a rough cotton towel. As she ladled the hearty stew into their individual metal bowls, Silas mentioned quietly over his shoulder that Maeve had proudly told him earlier that Abigail had allowed her to pour the dangerous soap mixture into the setting molds all by herself. Abigail carried the steaming bowls over to the table and replied softly that she had allowed it because the little girl possessed incredibly steady hands for her age, and more importantly, because she had specifically and politely asked for the responsibility. Silas dried his hands and face thoroughly, taking his seat at the head of the table, and observed in a low, thoughtful voice that his young daughter had not willingly asked much of anyone in a very long time. Recognizing the profound significance of her sudden request to participate, Abigail sat down directly across from him, looking at the children who were now eagerly eating their warm supper, and whispered that Maeve simply trusted him and was now carefully learning how to share that deep sense of trust with someone entirely new to the household. Silas slowly reached across the wooden boards of the table and took his bowl from her hands, his rough, calloused fingers intentionally brushing against hers for the briefest, most electrifying instant as he locked his gaze onto hers. He held her eyes with an unyielding intensity and told her in a voice meant only for her ears that he completely trusted her too, settling a deep, profound sense of peace directly into the center of her chest that completely chased away the remaining winter chill. Later that same night, after both children had been securely tucked into their warm beds, and the main fire had burned down to a low, glowing bed of red-hot embers, Abigail reached quietly for her woven mending basket sitting near the rocking chair. Silas sat directly across the small room from her, completely focused on carefully rubbing a thick layer of protective oil into his heavy leather saddle straps, the soft, flickering light from the dying coals casting deep, shifting shadows across the strong planes of his weathered face. Abigail threaded her needle with slow, deliberate movements, her eyes focused on the torn fabric in her lap, and confessed in a very quiet voice that she had absolutely never pictured having children in her life back when she lived in the eastern states. Silas looked up immediately from his leatherwork, his hands stilling completely, as she went on to explain that her lack of a family vision was not because she didn't desperately want children, but simply because she honestly never believed anyone would think she was good enough or pretty enough to stand beside them and raise a family together. He set the heavy, oiled leather strap down on the floor beside his chair, looking at her with absolute unwavering certainty, and told her firmly that she was absolutely enough, stating that she was, in fact, far more than enough for any man who had the common sense to see her true value. She set her needle and thread down carefully into her lap, her throat tightening with unexpected emotion, and told him honestly that she did not require fancy bouquets of flowers or grand poetic words of romance to be happy, because she wouldn't even know how to properly receive such things if they were offered. He nodded his head in complete understanding and admitted that he wouldn't even know how to give those fancy things anyway, but he promised with absolute sincerity that he could easily give her a solid, permanent place in this world that completely belonged to her. He offered her a fiercely loyal family that would absolutely never leave her behind, and the steadfast devotion of a man who would never ever forget the crushing, suffocating reality of what it truly felt like to be entirely alone in the world. Abigail stood up very slowly from her wooden chair, the mended fabric falling forgotten to the floor, and crossed the small, dimly lit room to stand directly in front of where he sat, while he rested his large hands openly on his knees, waiting patiently for her response. She looked down into his steady eyes and told him with absolute, unwavering conviction that she did not want to merely be a temporary guest in this house anymore, to which he instantly replied that she wasn't a guest, leading her to finally state that she wanted to stay permanently, fully, and completely, not out of any sense of charity, but out of a genuine, mutual wanting. The first massive winter snowstorm drifted across the Wyoming territory a few weeks later in a slow, completely silent wave, dusting the flat tops of the wooden fence rails with thick white powder and deeply softening the loud crunch of their heavy work boots over the packed dirt of the yard. Abigail stood out near the corner of the barn in the freezing morning air, her bare fingers turning a bright shade of red from the biting cold, as she expertly worked a long loop of brand-new hemp rope through the heavy iron ring of the wooden hitching rail. Silas had patiently taken the time to show her exactly how to braid the thick fibers significantly tighter just a few days prior, and her capable hands easily remembered the complex, repetitive motions even when her mind wandered off into deep thoughts about her new life. Silas was currently working across the snowy yard, steadily splitting massive ash logs into usable firewood with incredibly clean, powerful, and perfectly even strokes of his heavy iron axe, his breath forming thick white clouds in the freezing air. Each massive swing of his heavy tool sent a deep, satisfying rhythm echoing directly through the utter stillness of the winter morning, and she paused her intricate rope work more than once just to stand completely still and simply admire the strong, capable line of his broad shoulders shifting beneath the worn, heavy fabric of his canvas work coat. She felt absolutely no desperate, insecure need to call out to him or interrupt his intense focus, because over the past several months they had completely learned how to comfortably exist and move around each other for hours without ever needing to break the peaceful quiet that surrounded them. Inside the warm house, Maeve and Arthur were spending the morning with Mrs. Gable, a very kind elderly widow from the neighboring homestead who had happily agreed to sit and read with the children so that Abigail could safely take the heavy wooden wagon into the town of Laramie City to purchase some much-needed winter supplies. Silas had absolutely insisted that she take the wagon entirely by herself that morning, firmly telling her that she had more than earned some personal time away from the demanding chores of the homestead to simply exist for herself for a few hours, and though he hadn't said it with any flowery language, the incredibly thoughtful gesture had deeply moved her. She hadn't gone terribly far during her solo trip, just completing a direct route straight to the local mercantile store to purchase flour, sugar, and heavy winter wool before turning right back around. But the empowering feeling of being trusted to manage the trip alone had stuck firmly with her all day. She finished coiling the newly braided rope perfectly near the post and turned to walk back toward the warmth of the house, meeting Silas perfectly halfway across the yard as he carried a massive armful of freshly split kindling toward the back door, observing casually that she was standing incredibly steady in her new life. That very same evening, long after the heavy winter darkness had completely swallowed the surrounding prairie, and the two exhausted children were breathing deeply in their beds, Abigail walked out into the freezing night to find Silas working diligently inside the small, drafty wooden storage shed, carefully oiling the massive leather harnesses used for the heavy draft horses. The freezing air inside the small building smelled overwhelmingly of rich beeswax, old leather, and freezing dust, with the absolute only source of light coming from a small, slightly dented oil lantern hanging securely from a rusty iron nail driven directly into the main support beam beside him. She wrapped her thick shawl tighter against the biting cold and told him softly that she had never actually shared what she used to dream about back when she was trapped in her miserable, suffocating life in the eastern states, prompting him to completely stop his rhythmic polishing and respectfully ask her to tell him everything right now. She stepped slightly closer to the warm glow of the lantern and explained that all she had ever truly wanted in her entire life was a simple wooden window that faced the setting sun in the west, a warm kitchen that was filled with plenty of natural light, and a reliable partner who wouldn't just turn around and walk right out the front door the exact moment she opened her mouth to speak her mind. He deliberately set the heavy leather harness down onto the wooden workbench, stood up to his full towering height, and pointed out in his deep, rumbling voice that she currently possessed a bedroom window that looked perfectly out toward the western ridge, adding proudly that he had personally built a brand new set of shelves just last week, specifically to let more morning light filter directly over the kitchen sink. She took another slow step closer to him, the golden, flickering light of the small lantern perfectly illuminating the pale, natural rise of her cheekbones as she looked up at him and whispered with intense emotion, that he truly listened far more closely to her than any other person she had ever met in her entire existence. He looked down at her with an incredibly intense, searching gaze and stated simply that he spent a great deal of time watching her as well, pointing out that they were currently standing so close together in the freezing shed that the air between them felt inexplicably warm, far warmer than the tiny flame of the lantern could ever possibly explain. He confessed in a low, vibrating tone that he had been thinking constantly about the specific, wonderful way her presence completely filled up the empty spaces of his house, marveling at how she intrinsically knew exactly where every single item belonged without ever having to ask for directions. He noted with deep gratitude how much better and deeper the children were sleeping through the night since she had arrived, and, most importantly, he admitted that he himself was finally sleeping peacefully for the first time in 3 long, agonizing years. She swallowed hard, completely overwhelmed by his profound observations, and confessed her deepest lingering fear, stating that she constantly caught herself wondering exactly when he was finally going to tire of her and formally ask her to pack her bags and leave the property. Silas immediately reached out with both of his large calloused hands and gripped her shoulders firmly but gently, telling her with absolute unwavering certainty that she would never, ever be asked to leave this homestead under any circumstances whatsoever. She looked up directly into his shadowed eyes, her heart pounding frantically against her ribs, and asked him if he was entirely sure about such a massive, permanent commitment, to which he slowly slid his hands down her arms to softly, completely envelop her smaller hands within his own warm grasp. He spoke her name with incredible reverence, telling Abigail that he had already spent years living with a woman who was considered conventionally beautiful in the exact, superficial ways that constantly turned other people's heads when she walked down the street. But he made it incredibly clear that Abigail was the specific woman he had unknowingly built all of his future hopes around, without even consciously realizing he was doing it, until she had already become absolutely essential to his daily existence. Her breath hitched sharply in her chest at the incredibly profound weight of his heartfelt declaration, and she whispered back through tears of pure relief that she had originally been sent out to this harsh western territory simply to be claimed by a man who ultimately didn't even want her. He fiercely shook his head in complete disagreement, telling her with fierce conviction that she was absolutely not sent out here just to be carelessly claimed like some piece of unwanted property, but rather she was sent out here so that she could finally be truly and completely seen for the remarkable person she actually was. Then he leaned down very slowly and kissed her, his lips meeting hers with a slow, absolute certainty, kissing her exactly like a man who had been desperately wanting to do so for many long weeks, but had patiently waited because he needed her to know for an absolute fact that she was completely free to say no to him first. She absolutely did not say no, completely melting into his strong embrace, and when they finally parted from the deep, lingering kiss, she rested her forehead comfortably against his broad, solid chest, while his large hand remained incredibly warm and protective against the back of her neck. He held her close in the quiet darkness of the shed and told her in a steady, unbreakable voice that he formally wanted to marry her, quickly clarifying that it was absolutely not out of any practical need for a housekeeper, but simply because he actively and entirely chose her above anyone else in the world. She squeezed her eyes tightly shut, tears of absolute joy finally spilling warmly over her eyelashes, and whispered into his coat that this exact moment was everything she had ever desperately wanted in her entire life, feeling completely surrounded by the comforting scents of old leather, rich beeswax, and the soft, rhythmic hush of the winter snow falling gently against the wooden roof overhead. The incredibly joyous and highly anticipated wedding ceremony was held perfectly just after the final muddy thaw of the spring season, right when the massive cottonwood trees growing thickly along the muddy creek bed finally unfurled their pale, vibrant green buds, and the surrounding hills finally shed the very last stubborn patches of gray winter snow. Abigail stood proudly beneath a beautiful, handcrafted wooden archway that Silas had spent an entire week carefully building entirely by himself, with the thick wooden support posts meticulously wrapped in fresh, flexible willow branches and dozens of early blooming, sweet-smelling wild plum blossoms. Little Maeve had spent her entire morning carefully selecting the perfect sprig of wild purple, lavender to gently tuck directly behind Abigail's ear, her small, delicate fingers moving with incredible care and bursting with absolute pride at being given such an important, special task for the grand occasion. The guest list was intentionally kept very small and intimate, with only a very small handful of their closest neighbors making the long journey to attend, including the incredibly kind Mrs. Gable and her grown son, the two hard-working Blackstone brothers from the massive ranch. Situated over the next ridge, and a very quiet older couple who generously brought 2 loaves of warm, freshly baked bread and a large glass jar of sweet pickled onions as a wedding gift. Arthur stood incredibly straight and tall directly beside his father, his worn leather boots polished to a brilliant mirror-like shine, and his light brown hair combed down as flat as possible with water, though a highly stubborn cowlick still curled defiantly directly at the crown of his head. Abigail wore a beautiful, simple dress that she had meticulously sewn entirely by herself from yards of pure cream-colored muslin fabric, deliberately designing the elegant sleeves just long enough to effectively keep the sharp spring wind off her delicate wrists. She had absolutely not asked for any expensive, unnecessary lace or brightly colored silk ribbons to decorate the plain gown, because the only thing in the world she truly wanted was currently standing directly across from her, holding her gaze with the exact same deep, unwavering steadiness that had first allowed her to breathe easier on that dusty station bench. When the traveling town preacher finally finished speaking the traditional vows, Silas absolutely did not rush the highly anticipated moment. Instead, he slowly and deliberately reached out for her hand, as though he were carefully memorizing the exact, delicate shape of her fingers, resting completely within his massive, calloused palm. He kissed her only a single time, incredibly, gently and with profound respect, and she completely closed her eyes as their lips met, because she desperately wanted to feel the incredible weight and absolute permanence of that specific, life-altering moment, with everything else in the entire world completely blocked out and quieted down. Immediately after the beautiful ceremony concluded, the newly married couple happily served their few guests massive bowls of thick, hearty beef stew and dozens of hot, perfectly baked buttermilk biscuits, directly from the stone hearth, passing around a large metal tin completely filled with sweet molasses cookies that Maeve had enthusiastically helped bake. As the friendly neighbors finally began saying their warm goodbyes and climbing into their wagons, the deep purple dusk slowly began to settle over the vast open prairie, and Abigail found herself standing near the far edge of the wooden porch, holding little Maeve incredibly close while the young girl leaned her head happily against Abigail's side. The little girl suddenly looked up at the darkening sky and whispered softly that her mother had been entirely right when she promised that this exact thing would happen before she passed away. Abigail looked down at the sweet child in genuine confusion and asked exactly what her mother had promised her, to which Maeve replied that when her mother was incredibly sick with the fever, she had promised that someone truly special would eventually come to the house who absolutely knew exactly how to stay forever. Abigail did not try to offer any verbal answer to such a profound, heartbreakingly beautiful statement. Instead, she simply wrapped her arm much tighter around Maeve's small, trembling shoulders and held her securely against her side until the very first bright silver stars began to poke through the dark canvas of the night sky. Inside the warm house, Silas was slowly and methodically clearing the heavy ceramic dishes off the large wooden table, moving with a slow, but incredibly sure grace. His long shirt sleeves rolled high up past his muscular elbows and the top button of his clean collar completely unfastened for comfort. Abigail stepped softly into the room right behind him, carefully setting the very last stack of dirty plates directly into the metal wash basin, and murmured in a low, incredibly contented voice that she finally felt like she was truly home now. Silas immediately stopped what he was doing, dried his wet hands thoroughly on a clean cotton cloth, and turned around to face her, his expression incredibly soft and open in the warm candlelight. He looked directly into her eyes and corrected her gently but firmly, stating clearly that she didn't just feel like she was at home, but that she actually was the very definition of home to him and his children. They stood completely still together for a very long, quiet moment, perfectly surrounded by the soft popping sounds of the burning fire behind them, until he finally reached out, took her face gently in both of his large hands and kissed her again, this time with the deep, quiet reverence of a man who absolutely fully recognized the immense, priceless value of exactly what he had just been given. That very night, Abigail absolutely did not sleep entirely alone in the small, separate guest bedroom that she had occupied for so many long months. Instead, she lay comfortably directly beside her new husband in the main room she had once only quickly passed through to complete her daily chores, her head securely tucked against his shoulder while the fierce spring wind outside dipped low and howled aggressively, but the sturdy walls held incredibly strong. As the unpredictable spring weather finally settled comfortably into the long, hot, and highly productive days of early summer, with the sun rising earlier and earlier each morning, Abigail proudly accepted the highly respected position at the local town schoolhouse in Laramie City. She spent 3 long afternoons every single week patiently teaching the complex alphabet letters and basic arithmetic numbers to a chaotic room full of restless frontier children who constantly fidgeted in their hard wooden seats and frequently tripped over their reading words, but whose eyes absolutely lit up brilliantly whenever they finally understood a difficult concept for the very first time. She happily walked the long, dusty mile from the homestead, directly to the schoolhouse, and back again, every single day, returning home each late afternoon with her hands covered in fine white chalk dust, and a head full of amusing stories about her students to share with Silas and the children over supper. While she was teaching, Silas worked tirelessly out in the blazing hot sun to keep the massive herd of cattle completely sound and healthy, constantly walking the perimeter to keep all the miles of wooden fences perfectly mended against the pressure of the heavy livestock. When the incredibly heavy, torrential summer rains finally came pouring down in the middle of June, threatening to completely flood the lower pastures, Silas worked relentlessly to dig a massive, deep new drainage trench directly near the foundations of the main barn, so that the destructive water would safely run off completely clean and away from the animals. Arthur enthusiastically helped his father dig the long trench, standing significantly taller by now and swinging the heavy iron hammer with significantly more physical confidence and accuracy than he had the previous year, proving himself to be highly capable of doing a grown man's difficult labor. Meanwhile, Maeve spent her long, sunny afternoons sitting peacefully in the deep green grass, carefully sketching highly detailed charcoal pictures of the busy chickens and the winding creek bed on scraps of paper, her previous fragile shyness now completely replaced by a quiet, steady confidence that blossomed under Abigail's constant, loving encouragement. The entire family settled into a remarkably peaceful, incredibly steady daily rhythm that perfectly balanced the extremely hard physical labor required to maintain the large property, with deep moments of genuine connection and shared laughter during the quiet evenings. There was absolutely no lingering trace of the crippling loneliness or the devastating rejection that had originally brought Abigail to the empty station bench so many months ago, replaced entirely by a profound sense of total purpose and unwavering security. Every single day was an ongoing testament to the beautiful, undeniable truth that sometimes the most broken, discarded pieces of a ruined life can be carefully gathered up and built into something infinitely stronger and more beautiful than what was originally planned. One incredibly warm, beautiful evening, near the very end of July, Abigail stood completely barefoot in the rich, dark soil of the thriving vegetable garden, carefully brushing the loose, dry dirt directly from the palms of her hands onto her worn work apron, after pulling weeds for nearly an hour. The massive orange sun was sinking incredibly low, right directly behind the jagged western ridge, glowing brilliantly like a solid piece of molten gold filtering directly through the gently swaying dark green leaves of the tall cottonwood trees lining the property boundary. Silas walked up slowly from the barn directly behind her, deeply breathing in the fresh evening air, and gently looped his strong muscular arm securely directly around her narrow waist, pulling her back flush against his broad chest, in a highly comfortable, entirely natural gesture of deep affection. She leaned back perfectly against him, and observed casually that they were very nearly through harvesting all the ripe red tomatoes from the heavy vines, telling him that she planned to spend the entire day tomorrow completely focused on pickling the massive surplus, so they wouldn't go bad in the intense heat. He kissed the side of her temple softly, his lips warm against her skin, and immediately promised that he would spend his afternoon building several more sturdy wooden shelves down in the root cellar, specifically to hold all the heavy glass jars she was preparing to fill. Just at that quiet moment, Maeve called out loudly and excitedly from the front porch, waving a heavily folded, slightly battered paper envelope in the air quickly running out into the garden and handing it directly to Abigail with a massive, beaming smile. Abigail carefully opened the wax seal, unfolding the thick paper very slowly, and recognized immediately that the neat, elegant handwriting belonged directly to her favorite cousin Ruth back in Indiana, who was the exact same relative who had kindly whispered genuine words of profound comfort to her right after her beloved father had tragically passed away. Ruth was the absolutely only person from her previous, painful life who had ever consistently bothered to write her a letter without explicitly being asked or heavily guilted into doing so by other family members. Abigail read the entire letter perfectly aloud in the fading sunlight, smiling broadly as she read that Ruth had recently married a highly successful local tradesman's son and was now actively planning to make the long train journey out to the harsh Western Territory to visit their homestead exactly when the autumn season arrived. Ruth had clearly heard the shocking news through the family grapevine that Abigail had actually managed to get married out west, and she wrote that she absolutely could not believe her plain cousin's incredible luck, writing directly to ask exactly what her mysterious new frontier husband was truly like in person. Abigail looked directly up from the written page, completely ignoring the slightly backhanded nature of her cousin's written astonishment regarding her luck, and simply stared deeply right into Silas's remarkably steady, incredibly loving eyes as the golden hour completely enveloped them. She summarized the ending of the letter out loud, telling him directly that Ruth desperately wanted to come see the homestead for herself, and specifically wanted to know exactly what kind of man he actually was. He slowly reached up with one rough, calloused finger, and very gently brushed a stray curl of dark hair directly away from her flushed cheek, his voice dropping low and vibrating with absolute, undeniable sincerity, as he quietly asked her exactly what she was going to tell her cousin when she eventually wrote her reply. Abigail smiled softly, her heart completely overflowing with a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute peace and belonging, and stated that she was simply going to tell Ruth the complete, unvarnished truth, that he was exactly the incredibly rare kind of man who deliberately listened far more carefully than he ever spoke. She promised to write down exactly how he constantly built beautiful, sturdy wooden shelves specifically for her books without ever needing to be asked, how he patiently taught her exactly how to properly braid heavy rope and easily split thick ash logs, and most importantly, how he proved that he completely loved her every single day through his consistent actions without ever desperately needing to constantly validate it with flowery, empty words. He held her gaze with absolute, unshakable intensity as the very last rays of the sun slowly vanished, and he replied in a deep, unwavering voice that he did, in fact, entirely love her every single day of his life, proving that his actions and his words were completely and perfectly aligned. She leaned up on her tiptoes and kissed him right then, an incredibly soft but profoundly deep kiss. Exactly the comfortable, entirely secure kind of kiss that absolutely did not desperately ask for anything more to be proven, simply because everything of value had already been freely and entirely given. By the time the warm summer sun completely dipped fully behind the rolling hills and the glowing oil lanterns were brightly lit inside the windows, Abigail and Silas stood together on the front porch, with their arms securely wrapped tightly around each other, peacefully watching over the massive expanse of land that they had so painstakingly worked and beautifully shaped with their very own hands. The children were completely safe and happy inside the secure house, their bright, energetic voices murmuring low and contentedly as they played near the warm stove, and the sturdy log structure behind them glowed incredibly warm and inviting with bright yellow light against the falling darkness. There was absolutely nothing of real value that they lacked in their daily lives, and there was absolutely nowhere else in the entire world that they desperately longed to be, because they had successfully and permanently built something entirely real, incredibly profound, and beautifully permanent together, and they knew with absolute certainty that it would hold fiercely strong forever. Thank you so very much for staying with us and listening to the beautiful conclusion of Abigail and Silas's incredible journey. This touching story serves as a profound, uplifting reminder that true worth is absolutely never found in the superficial judgments of those who lack the vision to see beyond the surface, but rather in the quiet, steadfast, daily actions of those who genuinely value the real, hard-working heart underneath. It beautifully illustrates the incredibly positive message that sometimes the most painful, devastating rejections in our lives are actually life's exact way of firmly pointing us directly toward a much more authentic, deeply fulfilling love that we never would have found otherwise. If you found a sense of genuine hope or comfort in this narrative, please do not forget to subscribe to our channel, Wildwood Hearts, as your continued support allows us to keep bringing you more wonderful, heartfelt stories exactly like this one. We deeply appreciate your presence here today, and we truly cannot wait to share our next grand adventure with you very soon.